Imagine yourself as a caveman. If it helps, envision yourself in whatever hunter-gatherer outfit takes your fancy. Your caveman mind is occupied by a single thing: survival. Now let's say you live in a small hunter-gatherer community of around 20 people, and you get on quite well. One day, however, a newcomer shows up. You don't know how he got here, nor can you ask him, because neither of you can talk. But you notice a large mark on his shoulder. It's probably just a birthmark, but you don't know what a birthmark is. There's also something wrong with his eyes. One is a different color to the other, not to mention he has this smell, which makes your delicate caveman nose scrunch when it hits you. What would your reaction to this person be? Would you take him in, share food with him, trust him enough to let him become a member of your group? Or would you act with caution and treat him like a possible threat, although he comes in peace? Whatever you chose, now let's say the group decides to let him stay for a while, and over time he starts to become one of you. One morning, however, the others wake up and decide he doesn't belong here, he needs to go. You don't know what the reason is. Would you do anything to prevent his exile? Almost everyone wants him out, but not you. Are you going to stand up for him? Or are you going to accept his fate because you cannot risk ending up in his position? 96% of the 300,000 years we've been around has been spent living as hunter-gatherers. Your answers to the scenarios I just gave will have reflected that, because judging others and finding safety in numbers are things we're hardwired to do. When you live in a tiny, survival-based community, you must be able to judge fast and to judge decisively, to manage any threats. The wishes of the people you're with are also important. Either have the power to influence them, or be left with no choice but to conform. That's just human nature. But although there are patterns of behavior that we will always be shackled to, human nature also states that we're never static. Like our environments, we're constantly changing, meaning over time, we can see our patterns of thought and behavior repeating themselves. We do one thing, do it some more, counteract that thing, counteract it some more, then counteract the counteracting, we end up right where we started. Given the fact that the other 4% of our history has seen us rapidly increase in numbers and intelligence, we now live in comparatively ginormous societies that can go through multiple cycles of behavioral change in a single lifetime. What I want to talk to you about today is what happens to social change at the intersection of those cycles. But first, we must consider many societies are no longer purely survival-based. You and I no longer use our daily judgments to eject people from caves, meaning the main form of social change we regularly participate in is being representatives of our own ideologies in our day-to-day lives and in our contributions to activism. So, how can we use historical cycles of behavior to explain why right now social change operates a lot like a gladiator sport? For the first cycle, let's take a look at the changing tides of morality. If we go back to ancient Greece, in the 5th century BCE, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle used to spread ideas about wisdom and justice, living virtuously in public and in private. 1 century later, though, people became detached from those norms and they started to seek pleasure, which they thought was the chief good. And yet, by the time we reached the Roman Empire in the 1st century BCE, we turned right back, and the value of duty, discipline, and order re-emerged. Fast forward to last century, and the cycle gets faster. We swung from the 40s and 50s with a strict focus on moral conservatism straight to the 60s, which brought with them a social revolution, which saw many former moral taboos like drug use or sexual freedom become legal and become celebrated, until by the time we reached the 80s, we were already condemning the level of permissiveness that we'd allowed. The thing that society craves changes. We go from wanting virtue more than anything else to feeling suffocated by it and then seeking it out once again. That is the first cycle, that ideological seesaw. Now, you might be wondering, where are we currently placed in this loop? Well, think about it. Do you feel as though smaller offences are becoming more offensive? Have you witnessed squadrons of morality police stalking social media? These things would indicate that we're on the upwards slope of morality and we're becoming more moralistic, and yet, at the same time, there also exists a level of pushback already. In some places, the anti-woke crusade is just as ferocious as the woke one, so I'll leave that judgment up to you. We've looked at how society's values change, but the same trend crops up when we look at how they run, and that will be the second cycle. Take medieval Europe, where thanks to the feudal system, which saw one monarch reigning supreme over everyone, a tiny group had an iron fist on power. But the arrival of the Enlightenment caused people to stage revolutions against this, like the French, which tried to redistribute power to the once oppressed. But you can probably guess where this is going. The French Revolution saw the execution of a king, and yet Napoleon declared himself emperor right after. The same thing happens with other revolutions. In America, the new constitution replaced the British ruling class with its own tiny elite, made only of wealthy landowners. This cycle reoccurs all throughout history. Rigid hierarchies are shot down and rebuilt by the same people who did the shooting. Basically, those at top and bottom of society play cat and mouse with each other, and that is the second cycle. Let's revisit our position in all this. Right now, the impulse to call out different forms of authority, governments, institutions, even celebrities, is everywhere, right? Combine that with what we just discussed about an increase in the desire to appear virtuous, we can see how the combination of those cycles could result in the type of polarizing social movement we're used to, ones that like to flex their muscles at every given offense. For the third and final cycle, let's consider again the way societies run, but horizontally this time. By that, I mean how people go from being happy doing their own thing to suddenly wanting to band together and then going back to being happy doing their own thing. Let's look at the Salem witch trials, which took place in colonial Massachusetts. Although the colony had been built on the values of personal responsibility, personal pursuits of success, a state of group hysteria emerged, meaning people started to think that everyone's actions affected the whole community, which is why they executed the witches. And yet, after the trials, this blind allegiance to the group faded away again, and the value of individual rights resurfaced. Now, does that dynamic seem to ring any bells? The 17th century had witch hunts, and we have Twitter, TikTok comment sections that spontaneously transform into tribunals. Like the other cycles, this appears all throughout our past. We spend one decade preaching the value of personal freedom, then the next, we're all chanting in unison with one another, and each time we think we've never done this before. So we've established 3 cycles. What society considers important changes, the way it's governed changes, and the level of unity within it also changes. And right now, we exist at some point along each of those cycles. But the current time is also unique, because something exists that sets us quite apart from all the humans who came before us. You can leave comments on TikToks. You can talk to people on the other side of the world in real time. You can watch the news on your phone. 5.4 billion people online are now so connected that there exists an unmatched level of interaction between societies at different stages of these cycles. Online, new societies of people separated by entire continents are born. Technology puts communication on steroids. But how does that concern the things we've been discussing? Well, when information is so abundant and spreads so fast, our judgments become equally rapid, because the groups we join and defend are no longer 20 people living in a cave, but online clans of millions. The dialogue that would previously have taken place over centuries can take place over a number of days. Progress is accelerated because millions of people can share millions of opinions all at once. That's why we can say technology is a catalyst for social change, because it completely collapses the natural timelines of these processes and forces them all to occur at once. Just think about how social change operates today. Our moral judgments are theatricalized, our resentment of authority is inflamed, and our magnetic attraction to strangers who we think have the same thoughts as us is as high as it was when we did used to live in caves. But we like to tell ourselves we're different from back then. Thousands of years later, we've changed. We're not like the cavemen who just reacted, judged, followed, because we act out of reason and not reflex, right? And then when we're faced with the knowledge of these cycles, we tell ourselves, this time is different, because this time we see the full picture. Our movements are just, our outrage is righteous, and our progress is irreversible. But the Romans thought the same thing. So did the revolutionaries. So did the reformers before them. And yet here we are, chained to the same patterns, convinced we're some kind of an exception. If we've learnt so much from history, why do we continue to plagiarize it? Thank you.